The third week of October, at the Harrowfield Assembly Rooms, the candles had been lit 2 hours early against the weather, and Clara Wynne stood against the wall where companions were meant to stand, holding Lady Parrot's shawl across her forearm like a folded flag of a country that no longer existed. She was 24 years old. Her gown was grey muslin, turned once at the hem and turned again, and the room around her was the color of sugared fruit. Diamonds at throats, silk, the shade of apricots and river ice. The orchestra worked through a country dance with the particular cheerfulness of men paid by the hour. Clara did not dance. Clara held the shawl. She had held it, or one like it, for 6 seasons now. There is a craft to it that nobody writes down. The shawl must be carried so that it is instantly available and never visible. The companion must stand near enough to be summoned by a turn of the head, and far enough that no gentleman is obliged to acknowledge her. She must know the moment Lady Parrot's glass is empty before Lady Parrot knows it. She must be, in the fullest sense the word permits. Furniture that anticipates Clara had become very good at it. That was the injury nobody could see. Not the grey gown, not the turned hem, not the 24 pounds a year. The injury was that she was excellent at a thing that required her to be nobody, and excellence, once acquired, is difficult to set down. The room smelled of hot wax and hothouse flowers, and the particular sweetness of 40 people who have danced in wool. Somewhere behind her 2 women were discussing a settlement of £12,000 in the tone other people use for weather. Then the doors at the north end opened, and a footman announced the Duke of Ardenmoor, and every head in the room performed the small, violent turn that rank compels, and Clara looked up because everyone looked up, and she saw the crest. It was on the signet, on his left hand, catching the candlelight as he drew off his glove, a stag's head above 3 crossed arrows. She had last seen it 11 years ago, on the door of a carriage, in the rain, on the Bristol road. At the moment the carriage did not stop. The shawl slipped in her arms. She caught it. Nobody noticed. Nobody, that is, except the Duke, whose eyes came across the room in one slow, unhurried line and found her, and stayed 1 beat longer than the room could account for, and then moved on, as though nothing had occurred at all. "Who is that grey creature by the pillar?" said Lady Parrot's niece, not troubling to lower her voice. "The one clutching things." "That," said Lady Parrot, "is my companion, Miss Wynne. She is nobody, Georgiana, and she is very good at it." Clara heard it. Her face did not move. Her hands, which had learned their trade in 11 years of not moving, did not move either. Only her pulse betrayed her, going hard in the hollow of her throat, and she wondered, watching the Duke of Ardenmoor take the long room in 11 strides, whether he had any idea at all what his family's carriage had done on a wet road in the year 1814. He had. That was the thing she could not have known yet. He had thought of little else for 11 years. The set ended. The county rearranged itself. Clara watched the Duke of Ardenmoor be handed from group to group the way a valuable object is handed, and she watched him give each group exactly the same measure of attention, which was courteous and complete and entirely without warmth. And she thought that she had never seen a man work so hard at being present. Twice his hand went to his breast pocket. She counted. It was a habit so small that only a person whose whole employment was the noticing of small things would have registered it at all. Clara had not always been a companion. That is the part the assembly rooms had decided not to know, and the room's decision, once rendered, was rarely revisited. Her father had been a country attorney at Marsham, a man of small practice and large scruple, and he had died of a fever in the spring of 1814, owing £340 to a Bristol merchant who was not disposed to wait. Her mother had followed him in 6 weeks, less from fever than from the arithmetic. Clara had been 13. The house had been sold with the books still on the shelves. What remained was a road. She remembered the road better than she remembered her mother's face, which was a cruelty she had never confessed to anyone. She could recall the study at Marsham. Her father, at the desk, with his spectacles pushed up, working through a tenancy for a man who paid in cheese because he had nothing else. And her father, taking the cheese and her mother saying nothing about it at supper, because there was nothing to say that had not been said. She could recall being taught the Latin declensions at that desk, at 11 years old, for no reason either of them could have defended, simply because he thought a mind was a thing you furnished. That was what 340 pounds had bought. A man who took cheese and taught his daughter Latin. She had walked it in October with her aunt's direction, in her pocket 22 miles to Chippenham. And the rain had come down in that particular Somerset way that does not fall so much as settle soaking a person, by degrees so gradual that she does not notice she is drowning until she is. Her shoes had gone through at the heel by the 9th mile. She had counted milestones to keep from counting other things. At the 17th mile, a carriage had come up behind her. It was a good carriage. She had heard it before she saw it. The particular sound money makes on a bad road, and she had stopped and turned and lifted her hand, because she was 13 and had not yet learned that lifting one's hand is a thing the world charges for. The carriage had slowed. That was the part she carried. It had slowed, and the window had come down 2 inches, and she had seen the crest on the door, a stag's head, above 3 crossed arrows, wet and gleaming and beautiful. She had seen a man's face at the glass, older, gray, at the temple, considering her the way one considers a stone in a boot. And then the window had gone up, and the carriage had gone on, and the wheel had thrown a wave of brown water across her from shoulder to hem, and she had stood in the road and watched the crest recede into the gray until the road was empty again. She had stood there a long time. That was the part she had never told anyone either, because it made no sense and she could not defend it. She had stood in the road, with the water running off her chin, and she had not been angry. She had been embarrassed. She had felt, with perfect 13-year-old clarity, that she had done something wrong by lifting her hand, that she had made a request she had no standing to make, and that the man at the glass had been correct to look at her the way one looks at a stone in a boot. It had taken her 4 years to become angry. Anger, she had discovered, is a luxury good. One must be fed and dry before one can afford it. She had walked the remaining 5 miles. She had not cried. She had arrived at her aunt's door at 9 in the evening and been given soup and a bed and within the year a position. Because an educated girl without money is a problem that solves itself if you are patient. 11 years. And in all that time she had never once told the story aloud because she had understood very early what the story would sound like in a drawing room, and she had no appetite for being pitied by people who would have kept driving. Now the Crest was in the room with her. She got through the assembly by the method she had perfected, which was to be so entirely useful that no one had leisure to look at her. She fetched Lady Parrott's fan. She fetched Lady Parrott's negus. She held Georgiana's gloves during the boulanger, and returned them warm, and did not comment on the state of them. At 11:30, the Duke of Ardmore stopped in front of her. He was tall, and he had the kind of stillness that men of enormous consequence sometimes have, and men of moderate consequence never manage. Dark hair. A face composed the way a wall is composed. His coat was navy, and fit him the way a coat fits when 6 men have spent a month on it. "You are Lady Parrott's companion," he said. His voice was low and entirely level. "I am your grace. Your name." She looked at his hand, at the signet, at the stag, and the 3 arrows an arm's length from her face, and she felt something go through her that was not fear and was not anger, and had no name she was willing to give it. "Win, your grace." Miss Wynne. She had said her own name perhaps 4,000 times in 6 seasons. It had never once cost her anything. It cost her something now, and she could not have said what, only that the 2 syllables came out of her mouth and hung in the air between them like an admission. Something happened in his face. It was very small. A tightening at the jaw, a fractional narrowing, the whole event lasting perhaps half a second, and visible only to someone standing close enough to hold the shawl. "Win," he said. "Yes, your grace of Marsham." The floor did not actually move. It only felt as though it had. Clara's hand found the back of a chair and rested there, lightly, the way a hand rests when it has decided independently that it requires assistance. "How does your grace know Marsham?" she said. He did not answer her. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he inclined his head, the precise degree that a duke inclined his head to a servant, and he walked away. She stood there with her hand on the chair back, and her heart going like a bird in a box, and she thought, with a clarity that shamed her, that he knew. He knows, and he is going to pretend he does not. And I am going to let him. Because I am paid £24 a year, and my aunt is dead. That was the first night. The rest of it took the autumn. Lady Parrott's house at Harrowfield was 3 miles from the Ardmore estate, and the Dowager Duchess of Ardmore had spent 40 years teaching the county that 3 miles was either nothing at all or an unbridgeable distance depending entirely upon who was proposing to cross it. She was 71. She sat in state in a rose drawing-room with a fan she held at a measured height, and she had a way of greeting a person that adjusted itself mid-sentence once she had recalculated their rank, so that the first half of the greeting was warmer than the second, and the person went away knowing exactly what had happened, without being able to name it. "Parrot," she said on the first call of the season, "you have brought your girl, my companion, Miss Wynne." The dowager's eyes went over Clara once, from the plain bonnet to the mended gloves. An inventory, conducted with the thoroughness of a customs officer. "Yes," she said. "Well, she may sit by the window." Clara sat by the window. The window seat was cold. It was always cold. There was a draught off the glass that the ladies at the fire were not obliged to know about, and Clara had worked out in her first season that the placement of a companion in a room is never accidental, and never quite cruel enough to name. From the window she could see the drive, and the beech avenue, and the gates with the stag's head worked into the iron above them, and she looked at those gates for an hour and a quarter, while the ladies discussed the Hartley wedding and the price of coal. The Duke came in at 4. He did not look at her. He stood at the head of the room with his back to the fire and answered his mother in short, level sentences, and at some point in the conversation his hand went to his breast pocket. Briefly, the way a man touches a thing to confirm it is still there, and then came away again. Clara noticed. Clara was in the business of noticing. It was, in fact, the only property she had left. "You will take Georgiana to the Michaelmas ball," said the dowager. "It was not a question. I had not considered it. Consider it. She is the Parrott girl. She has 8,000 a year. And you are 36 years old, and unmarried, which the county has begun to find eccentric. The county finds many things eccentric. The county," said the dowager, "is not wrong as often as you imagine." And then, without changing her tone at all, she turned her head toward the window and said, "Miss Wynne, the fire is smoking. See to it." The fire was not smoking. Clara rose and saw to it. She knelt on the hearth in her gray gown and adjusted a log that required no adjustment while 9 women watched her do it, and when she stood up again her hands were black to the second knuckle, and there was nowhere in the rose drawing-room to wash them. She stood on the hearthrug with her hands held slightly away from her gown so as not to mark it, and the conversation resumed over her head, and a woman in puce remarked that the Hartley girl had been fortunate in her teeth. There was a footman by the door. He was perhaps 18. He looked at Clara's hands, and then at the carpet, and his face did the thing a young face does when it has been trained out of an opinion it is still having. The Duke of Ardmore was looking at the ceiling. His jaw was set like something quarried. His hand had closed on the mantel-shelf, and the knuckles had gone white, and he held it that way for the better part of a minute before he let go. Nobody in the room understood what they were seeing. Clara did not understand it either. Stay with her a while. What happened in the Rose drawing-room that afternoon was not the cruelty. It was only the rehearsal. The Duke rode past the Harrowfield gate on the 14th of October. Clara was in the lane with the pug, because walking Lady Parrott's pug was among her duties, and the pug had opinions. He drew up. He did not dismount. "You walk out alone," he said. "With the dog, your grace. The lane floods at the turning. It is not passable after rain." "I know it, your grace." "Then go back by the upper path." It was an order. It was flatly an order, delivered from a horse by a man who had not asked her a single thing, and Clara felt her chin come up before she could stop it. "Your Grace is very concerned with Elaine." He looked down at her. The horse shifted. Somewhere behind the hedge a blackbird was making the noise. Blackbirds make when they have decided against you. "Go back by the upper path, Miss Wynne," he said, and rode on. She went back by the upper path. She was furious the entire way, and she could not have said under oath what she was furious about, and her face was warm in the October air, in a manner the October air did not explain. He had known the lane flooded. That was the thing that would not leave her alone. A man with 11,000 acres, and a steward for every field of it, had known which turning of which lane took water after rain, and had known it well enough to stop a horse in it and say so. Nobody had told her to go the safe way in 11 years. She had not known. She remembered what it sounded like. The pug had no opinion about that. He came again on the 19th to Lady Parrott's, on business regarding a boundary ditch that could have been settled by any steward in England. He stayed 40 minutes. He asked Clara, in front of Lady Parrott, whether the library at Harrowfield still held the Marsham parish registers. And Lady Parrott said she was sure she had no idea. And Clara said, "The registers are at Marsham, Your Grace." "In the church, are they?" "They are. Your Grace." He said nothing else. He left. Clara stood in the hall afterward with her heart going. He was looking for something. He is looking for something. And it has my father's name on it. "Eat," someone said behind her, and she turned, and it was only Mrs. Dunhill, the housekeeper, with a plate of bread and butter. But Clara's hands were shaking so distinctly that Mrs. Dunhill saw it, and put the plate down, and did not remark on it, which was the kindest thing that had happened to Clara in some months. Clara sat down on the bottom stair, which was not permitted, and put the plate beside her, and looked at her own hands until they stopped. Mrs. Dunhill had been at Harrowfield 31 years. She had a chapped red hand and a memory like a ledger, and she was the only person in the county who knew that Clara read Latin. "You want to be careful of that one," she said. "Of which one, Mrs. Dunhill?" "Of any of them, my duck," said Mrs. Dunhill. "They are all one family up at that house, and they none of them ever stopped for anybody." She had not meant it the way Clara heard it. She could not have. She went off toward the still room with her keys chiming. And Clara stood in the hall holding bread and butter she could not eat, and the sentence went through her like a needle through cloth. They none of them ever stopped for anybody. The Michaelmas ball at Arden Moor was the arena, and everyone in 3 counties understood it as such. Georgiana Parrott wore ice blue with pearls, and looked, it must be said, honestly, extremely well. She was 19 and not stupid and not cruel, only very certain. The way a person is certain when every room she has ever entered has agreed with her. Clara wore gray. She stood behind Lady Parrott's chair for 4 hours, and watched the county perform itself. At 10:30, the dowager gathered a group by the terrace doors, and told a story. It was a good story, delivered well, about a girl in the neighborhood who had come down in the world and got herself a place and had begun, the dowager said, to imagine that a place was the same thing as a position. "She looks at the gates when she thinks nobody is watching," said the dowager. "One almost pities it. She is nobody, of course. And the trouble with nobody is that nobody so often forgets it." 40 people heard her. Clara was 11 feet away with a shawl over her arm. The room did the thing rooms do. A ripple, a settling, the particular soft noise of fans coming up. Georgiana laughed, because everyone laughed, and then stopped laughing when she saw Clara's face, and looked for a moment genuinely uncertain. And the Duke of Ardenmore at the far end of the room set down a glass he had not drunk from, and the sound of it on the marble was small and very distinct, and every muscle in his back was visible through the navy coat. He did not cross the room. Clara saw him not cross it. She understood exactly what it meant. He would not defend her, because she was not defensible, because she was gray muslin in a room of apricot silk, and there was no version of the world in which the Duke of Ardmore announced across 40 people that his mother was wrong. She had known that. She had known it since she was 13, and stood in a road. It still went through her like cold water. The orchestra began the next set. That was the obscenity of it. 40 people had watched a 71-year-old woman take her apart in a single well-made anecdote, and the violins came in on the beat, and the county formed its lines, and Georgiana was led out by a young man with a red neck, and the shawl was still over Clara's arm because nobody had asked her for it and nobody was going to. Lady Parrot turned in her chair. "My fan," she said. She left the ballroom at 11. She did not go to the carriage. She went out the terrace doors and down the steps and along the gravel to the west front where nobody went, and she stood in the dark under a window with her arms wrapped around herself and let herself for 90 seconds be 24 years old and tired. The rain started. Of course it did. She heard the step behind her and did not turn. "Come inside," said the Duke of Ardmore. "No, Your Grace." There was a silence. It went on long enough that she heard the rain in the beeches and the orchestra faint through the glass and her own breath. "It was my father," he said. Now she turned. He was standing 6 feet away with the light from the window on one side of his face, and the rain darkening his shoulders, and he had not put on a hat, and he looked, for the first time since she had met him, like a man rather than a wall. "I was 25, he said. "I was in the carriage, on the Bristol Road, in October, in the rain. There was a girl at the 17th milestone with her hand up and no coat, and her shoes gone at the heel. I asked him to stop. He stopped. He looked at her for 4 seconds and he said, 'She was somebody's problem and not ours,' and he put up the glass and we drove on, and I did not open the door. The rain came down. I was 25, he said again, and I had 2 hands and a voice and I did not open the door. I have thought about the door every day for 11 years. I have never once been able to make the ending come out differently." Clara stood in the wet gravel and could not speak. "When my father died," he said, "I sent to Marsham. There was an attorney of that name who died in the spring of 1814. I found the debt. £340 to a Bristol merchant, discharged by the sale of a house, with the book still in it. I have had a man looking for his daughter for 9 years. He drew something from his breast pocket. It was a small thing, flat, and she could not see it in the dark. 9 years, he said. And then Lady Parrot brought you into an assembly room and stood you against a wall. Your Grace, I knew you by the shoes, he said. You had turned the hem twice. My father did not look at her shoes. I did. The rain went on. It was in his hair now and running at his collar, and he did not appear to have noticed it. I have had every advantage a man can be handed, he said. Rank and fortune, and a name that opens any door in this county, and I have never once used any of it to open a door that was actually in front of me. I have thought about that too. And Clara, who had not cried on the Bristol Road, who had not cried at her aunt's funeral, who had not cried in the Rose drawing-room with her hands black to the knuckle, put her hand over her mouth and made no sound at all while her shoulders went. He did not touch her. He stood in the rain 6 feet away and let her have it, which was, she understood later, the single most decent thing any person had ever done for her. When she could speak, she said, You could have written. I could have. You did not. No. Why, the Duke of Ardmore looked at the object in his hand. Because I did not know what I would be asking for, he said. And I found that I minded, very much, what the answer might be. That is not a good reason. It is the only one I have. He held it out. She took it. It was a milestone rubbing, done in pencil on a scrap of paper folded so many times. The creases had gone furred and soft, and in the middle of it, in the ordinary letters of the Bristol Road, was the number 17. I went back, he said. The following spring, I could not think what else to do. She stood in the rain and held 11 years in her hand. Come inside, Miss Wynne, he said. And this time it was not an order at all, and she heard at last what had always been inside the orders. She did not go inside. She went home to Harrowfield in the carriage with Lady Parrot and Georgiana, and she sat with her back straight and the folded paper in her sleeve against her wrist, and Georgiana looked at her 3 times and said nothing. It should have ended there. It did not, because the Dowager Duchess of Ardenmore had spent 71 years learning to read a room, and she had read that one. The letter came to Harrowfield on the 3rd of November. It was addressed to Lady Parrot, and it was very polite. It observed that the season had been agreeable, that Miss Parrot's manners did her credit, and that in the Dowager's view, a companion who had begun to be discussed was a companion who had ceased to be useful. It suggested Bath. It named an agency. It enclosed, in the tone of a woman doing a kindness, a character reference praising her handwriting. Lady Parrot read it aloud at breakfast in front of the footman. "Well," she said, "that is that. You will go to Bath, Win. Georgiana, do not slouch." "When?" said Clara Friday. "The Dowager has been very good about it, considering." "Considering what, ma'am?" Lady Parrot looked up, mildly surprised the way a person is surprised when furniture speaks. "Considering the talk," she said, "one does not blame you. A companion in your circumstances is nobody at all, and a nobody who is noticed is simply a nuisance, and you were noticed. Do not sulk. It does not suit your face." Clara went up to a room, which was under the eaves, and had one window, and she sat on the bed and did not sulk. She took out the folded paper, and looked at the number 17, and thought about Bath, and about the agency, and about the arithmetic of a woman of 24 with £24 a year, and a character reference praising her handwriting. She thought about it honestly, which is a harder thing than it sounds. She could go to Bath, there would be another Lady Parrot, and another shawl and another window seat, and in 20 years she would be Mrs. Dunhill with a red hand and a ring of keys, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, a good deal more than most women in her position were offered. The paper in her hand said 17. Then she got up, did something that took every particle of courage she had ever possessed. She went down to the still room and asked Mrs. Dunhill for the loan of 2 shillings and a boy. "For what, my duck?" "To carry a letter to Marsham," said Clara to the vicar. "I want the register of my father's burial and the schedule of his debts, and I want them by Thursday, and I will pay you back out of Bath." Dunhill looked at her for a long moment. "You will pay me back," she said, "by not going to Bath." She went to the drawer where the household money lived, and counted out 2 shillings and put them in Clara's hand, and closed the fingers over them. "I said, they none of them ever stopped," said Mrs. Dunhill. "I want it on the record that I have been 31 years in this house, and I have been wrong about a great many things, and I should like very much to be wrong about this one. The boy went at noon. The Parrot dinner, on the 11th of November, was for 30 Ul. It was in the same rooms where the Michaelmas ball had been held, because Lady Parrot had prevailed upon the Dowager for the loan of them. The Dowager had agreed, because a Dowager who is displacing a companion likes to do it in front of witnesses. Clara was not invited. Clara was in attendance, which is a different thing, and stood behind the chairs. She had dressed with care that evening, which was a small private defiance nobody would ever detect. The grey gown, brushed, the hem turned a 3rd time and pressed under a damp cloth until the crease was invisible. Her mother's small garnet pin at the throat, the one thing that had not been sold, worn under the fichu where nobody could see it and she could feel it. Mr. Holloway sat at the far end of the table between 2 women who did not address him. He had been at the Michaelmas ball as well, and at the Parrot dinner in October, and Clara had noticed him each time and had filed him as a land agent and thought no more about it. In her sleeve against the pulse of her wrist was a folded scrap of paper with the number 17 on it. The soup went round. The Dowager at the head, in grey silk and diamonds, addressed the table. "Miss Parrot goes to town in the spring," she said, "and my son will be there, and I am told there is to be an announcement, though I am sure I know nothing of it." Georgiana went pink. The table made its noise. And the Dowager, turning her head very slightly, said to the woman at her left, in a voice pitched to carry the length of 30 covers, "We are also losing the Parrot companion, Bath, I believe. It is best. She is nobody, and it had begun to be remarked upon, and there is nothing so untidy as a nobody who does not know it. Third time, same words, third setting, and the third time is the one that breaks something. The room turned to look. 30 faces. Clara stood behind Lady Parrot's chair with her hands at her sides, and her father's daughter's spine. The Duke of Arden-Moor put down his spoon. He rose. He did not hurry. He came the length of that table in 11 strides past the apern and the candles and the woman in ice blue, and the room went so quiet that the fire in the great grate was audible, and he stopped in front of her and offered his hand palm up in front of 30 people. She looked at it. She put her hand in it. "Arden-Moor," said the dowager. "Sit down." He did not sit down. He turned, with Clara's hand in his, and faced his mother down the length of the table. And in the silence he had built, he said, "This is Clara Wynne. I mean to marry her." 9 words. That was all. They landed in the quiet like a coin on stone. Nothing happened for 3 full seconds. Then the Dowager Duchess of Arden-Moor said, "You cannot," and her voice was not polished. And her fan, which had been held at a measured height for 40 years, came down onto the cloth with a small flat sound and stayed there. "You cannot. She is Arden-Moor. She is A. She has nothing." "She had a father," said the Duke, "and he had a debt of £340. And my father passed her on a road in the rain, and did not stop, and I was in the carriage." The silence changed quality. It is a thing rooms do when they understand. "I have been looking for her for 9 years, he said. "Mr. Stand, Halloway has the Marsham Register and the schedule of the debt, and he will speak to any person here who wishes to hear it." The solicitor at the far end of the table, a small, dry man nobody had accounted for, who had been at 3 dinners that month and been seen by no one, inclined his head. "Lady Parrot," said Wynne, in a tone of pure bewilderment. And Georgiana, 19 years old in ice blue and pearls, looked at her grandmother's friend, and then at Clara, and then at the Duke, and did the one thing nobody in that room had the wit to expect. She stood up. "I withdraw," she said. Her voice cracked in the middle of it. "Whatever there was to withdraw from, I withdraw it." Somewhere down the table a man said quietly, "Good girl," and it was not clear who. The dowager sat in her chair at the head of 30 covers, and looked at her fan lying on the cloth, and for the first time in the memory of the county, she did not pick it up. Her hand went out toward it twice. Twice it stopped. Down the table a woman in garnets began very quietly to cry, and could not have explained why, and put her napkin to her face. "He would have stopped," she said, "your father, if she had been. He would have stopped for a different sort of girl." "Yes," said the Duke of Arden-Moor. "I know. And that was the whole of it. He did not say another word to her. He did not need to." The room had heard the sentence, and the room had understood what it meant, and the dowager understood that they had understood, and she sat very upright in her chair, while the servants took away the soup. Clara said nothing at all. She stood with her hand in his in a room of 30 people who had known her name for 6 weeks and had not once used it, and she did not gloat, and she did not weep, and she did not say a word, because there was nothing she could have said that would have been truer than standing there. They were married in the spring, at Marsham, in the church where the registers were kept. It was not a large wedding. Mrs. Dunhill came. In a bonnet she had trimmed herself, and cried steadily and without embarrassment from the first word to the last. Mr. Halloway came, and produced, at the breakfast afterward, a document nobody had asked for, the discharged bond for £340, bought back from the Bristol merchant's heirs at a price he declined to name. Georgiana came. She had written to Clara in January, a letter of 4 crossed pages badly spelled and entirely honest, and Clara had written back. The dowager did not come. She sent instead a short note in a hand that shook slightly, which said only that the Arden-Moor pearls belonged to the Duchess of Arden-Moor and were therefore no longer hers to keep, and a box. Clara wore them. She wore them because refusing would have been an answer, and she had decided, on the whole, not to give one. That was the correction. It was not a punishment. Nobody in that family ever spoke of the road again except the two people who had been on it. The house at Marsham was bought back that summer. Not the practice which had gone to a man from Bristol, only the house, with a new set of books on the old shelves and the same crooked window on the landing. Clara did not live in it. She could not have said why she wanted it. And he did not ask her to. It stood there with a caretaker and a fire lit twice a week, and that was apparently what it was for. They came to Marsham each October after that, on the anniversary, and drove the Bristol road out to the 17th milestone. And it became a thing the household understood without being told, the way households do. The autumn Clara turned 28. The rain came down in that particular Somerset way, settling rather than falling, and they stopped the carriage at the milestone, and he handed her down into the wet grass. She was not wearing the pearls. She was wearing an old cloak and shoes that were entirely sound. The stone was low and green with lichen. The 17 was nearly gone. She knelt in the grass and put her bare hand flat against the number, the way she had put her hand against a chair back in a rose drawing room, and the stone was cold and her hand was warm, and behind her the carriage door stood open in the rain, with the stag and the 3 arrows dark and streaming on the panel. The road ran away north and south exactly as it had. It had not been improved. The hedges were the same hedges, and somewhere in them, a blackbird was making the noise blackbirds make, and there was no reason on earth that the whole of a life should turn on a particular quarter-mile of Somerset. And it had. The door stood open, it went on standing open. That was the difference, and it was the whole difference, and neither of them ever said so aloud. He came and stood beside her, and did not tell her to come inside. Thank you for staying to the end. If Clara's road stayed with you, sit with it a moment before you go.